Who was Salvatore Maranzano, and is this his image you are looking at now? Numerous publications, including those by J. Robert Nash, identify this picture as being that of the Old World Mafia Godfather who battled Joe the Boss Masseria during the Castellammarese War in the early years of the 20th century. But recently, the validity of this picture has come into question. David Critchley, writing for the Informer Journal, makes a compelling case as to why this is not a photo of Maranzano. But perhaps the best argument is the argument from silence. Joseph Bonanno, Mafia Don and head of the family which still bears his name, in his autobiography, Man of Honor, though he includes pictures from the time period, never includes this picture, identifying it as his one-time godfather, though this picture was already in wide circulation at the time he wrote his book. Maranzano was a careful and private man. He was never arrested while in this country, and therefore he never had his mugshot taken by law enforcement. The only known pictures are a few death scene photos from September 10, 1931, the date of his assassination. Bonanno described Maranzano as robust and about 5 feet 9 inches tall, full-bodied with no excess flaccid flesh on him, deep-chested with sturdy muscular arms and legs. Maranzano was handsome. He could make his face smile sweetly, or he could look severe enough to make you tremble. Based on the crime scene photos and Bonanno's description, one artist attempts to give us a possible glimpse of how the man appeared in life. Perhaps this is accurate, and perhaps not. Which brings us back to the question, just who was Salvatore Maranzano? Let us first state who he was not. In the 1991 Hollywood blockbuster movie Mobsters, the character who is represented as the arch-rival to Joe the Boss Masseria isn't even a shadow of the true Salvatore Maranzano. In fact, if you listen carefully when his name is mentioned by others, his last name was changed to Farenzano. Evidently, the writers knew this was a fictional character. The real Maranzano was an old-world mafioso who clung tightly to the traditions of his birthplace, Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily. Though he was a traditionalist, in another sense, he was also a visionary. He is credited by many historians as the founder of the modern-day U.S. Mafia in New York and its division into the 5 families. And yet, in spite of being somewhat of a futurist, he was considered by others to be a throwback, a mustache Pete who only trusted those of Sicilian descent and was quick to settle a dispute the old-fashioned way, the vendetta. Born on July 31, 1886, Salvatore Maranzano actually studied for the priesthood. For reasons not known, he eventually gave up this pursuit and took up with the mafia in his hometown. By those who knew him, he was considered highly intelligent and very proper in his mannerisms. He was fairly fluent in Latin, and he loved to study history. Selwyn Robb writes, Maranzano had a very commanding presence and was greatly respected by his underworld peers. He had a fascination with Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire and enjoyed talking to his less educated American Mafia counterparts about these subjects. Maranzano immigrated to the United States soon after World War I, settling in Brooklyn, New York. Numerous dates are given for his arrival in the New World, such as 1918, 1925, and 1927, but no one knows for certain. Carl Sifakis speculates, it's possible he moved in and out of the country several times before finally settling here in 1927. While building a legitimate business as a real estate broker, Maranzano also maintained a growing bootlegging business, later branching out into other criminal enterprises, including narcotics smuggling. He used his charm and the profits from his illegal activities to bring smaller gangs under his umbrella, gangs who were being squashed or forced to pay large amounts of extortion money to the big boss at the time, Joe Masseria. Masseria was both feared and hated. Carl Sifakis explains, Joe the Boss was a glutton in personal habits as well as administration of criminal activities. He demanded that other mafioso pay him enormous tribute. Maranzano cultivated the resentment this stirred up in Masseria's subchiefs, and he worked on winning defections by promising a fair division of the loot. Maranzano organized a cadre of men under his banner who thought as he did and who came from the same region in Sicily, like Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Profaci, and Stefano Magandino. During the 1920s, Joe the Boss began to move against the growing Bonanno-Profaci operations. You see, Joe the Boss fancied himself as the boss of everyone. Maranzano and his friends didn't trust Masseria, and so they prepared for war. Some historians mark the beginning of the war in 1927, a simmering angst, a sort of Cold War, if you will. According to informer Joe Valachi and the testimony he gave before the Congressional Subcommittee in 1962, the Cold War ended in 1928 when the shooting began. Maranzano dispatched death squads to seek out Masseria men. In 1930, the peak year of the war, they came across Masseria Lieutenant Gaetano Rina on August 15th and filled him full of lead. By the end of 1930, it was apparent to most that Maranzano, who was better organized and whose troops were more loyal, was coming out on top. Seeing the handwriting on the wall, coupled with the lost revenue as a result of the war, Masseria's top men, Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello, were growing battle-weary. They had plans, big plans, and they wanted to get back to the business at hand, the business of making money. They sought peace with Maranzano, but Joe the Boss would have none of it. After making a deal with Maranzano, they dispatched a hit team of gangsters from various gangs and different ethnic backgrounds to take out Masseria, who was shot while having dinner with Luciano at a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931. Approximately 2 weeks later, Maranzano called a meeting in which over 500 New York mafioso attended, including Masseria's aforementioned lieutenants. According to Valachi, Maranzano rented a large hall on Washington Street in the Bronx for the gathering. Maranzano sat in a chair which resembled a throne according to Valachi, and a large cross hung over his head. This was done to give the appearance of a religious meeting in case some pain-in-the-ass innocent bystander wandered into the meeting by mistake. Maranzano outlined a new family structure, limiting the number in New York to 5. He broke down their ranks and duties based on his knowledge of the Roman legions. There would be a boss, an underboss, consiglieri, capo regime, and soldiers. And Maranzano? Now he would be the boss of bosses. Maranzano lectured the gangsters on proper etiquette and protocol. He made frequent references to Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. He warned the newly created families that the war was over and no vendetta was to be enacted against another member, even if that member had killed a brother. Luciano, Costello, and Genovese nodded in agreement, but they quickly realized they had traded one mustache Pete for another. Though they liked Maranzano's 5-family plan for New York, they didn't want to be under the thumb of a new boss of bosses, so they quickly decided that Maranzano had to go. But distrust was a two-way street. According to Valachi, Maranzano had secretly hired Vincent Mad Dog Cole to take out his newly appointed lieutenants. He felt they couldn't be trusted. After all, they had turned on their previous boss. But Maranzano didn't stop there. He added more enemies to his hit list, including Al Capone, Willie Moretti, Joey Adonis, and Dutch Schultz, gangsters he didn't like and felt he couldn't work with. On the afternoon of September 10, 1931, just 5 months after the demise of Joe Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano, the last of the boss of bosses, fell. 4 men dressed as police officers and tax agents entered his real estate office in the Eagle Building on Park Avenue. They pulled out guns, and one of the assassins, Samuel Red Levine, had a knife. Levine stabbed the boss of bosses 6 times. In a desperate attempt, Maranzano lunged for his assailants, and they drew out their guns, riddling his body with lead. During the next 48 hours, other Old World mafioso were killed in what many described as a purge planned by Johnny Torrio and executed by Charles Lucky Luciano. It is interesting to note that Bonanno, in his book, who on the one hand describes himself as forever loyal to Maranzano, casually brushes over his execution. Almost as if Maranzano had betrayed what they fought for in the war, and Bonanno kinda shrugs it off. Oh well. Anthony Bruno, writing for the Crime Library, concludes, Joseph Bonanno claims that he knew nothing of the plot to kill Maranzano, a statement that defies mob logic. If he had been as loyal to Maranzano as he says, then he too would have been assassinated. But in fact, he benefited greatly from Maranzano's demise, becoming the boss of a sizable portion of Maranzano's gang. At age 26, he became the youngest crime boss in America. Perhaps Bonanno did fear he was next, and therefore felt he had no choice but to nod in agreement at the plans of Luciano and others. Or possibly still, he did the math. Either a boss of bosses or a commission was going to meddle in the affairs of his family, and therefore he chose the latter, believing in the least that he would have a voice. Whichever the case, the National Crime Syndicate was born, and Luciano abolished the position of boss of bosses. Now crime was nationwide, overseen by a board of directors. In what can only be described as somewhat ironic, Salvatore Maranzano was laid to rest in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, located in New York City. And not far from his grave lie the remains of Charles Lucky Luciano.